This week in gaming, Razer has unveiled a gaming smartphone. Owlboy now has a console release date of February 13th. Super Mario Odyssey is selling like hotcakes. Publisher Perfect World has shut down gigantic developer Motiga and Torchlight developer Runic. The Paris Games Week kicked off. Happy BlizzCon 2017 to those attending. Original Xbox games came to the Xbox One last week, and yes, that's an incredibly confusing thing to say, but we had to say it this week. The Kinect has been discontinued officially. Battleborn has seen its final update. There's going to be a Xenoblade Chronicles 2 Nintendo Direct on November 7th, and we are so sorry we vanished again. We might have to change the name of this show to 1RBC Gaming every other week. This is 1RBC Gaming Weekly. First off, the Paris Games Week kicked off and brought some interesting news. Sony held a major press conference and unveiled a ton of stuff that's coming to the PS4 in the coming months. Some of the announcements from the show seemed a little surprising. Are they leaving anything intact for the PlayStation experience that's coming up in about a month? Perhaps the reason for this big push is to draw attention away from the upcoming release of the Xbox One X, which is coming out on November 7th. This holiday season, competition in the gaming space will be fierce. Personally, I'm expecting the Switch to be a top seller, but I'm not placing any bets on Xbox or PlayStation, because while the Xbox One X may be a hot seller on account of its bump stats, it doesn't seem to be bringing a whole lot of new features to the table. Honestly, how big a deal is 4K at this point in time? Not that big. Meanwhile, Nintendo has released some of the hottest games of the year on the Switch. The new Zelda and Mario games have performed incredibly well. Anyway, to talk about the PlayStation press conference, a new trailer for the upcoming Spider-Man PS4 game was released. It introduced Miles Morales, and we saw a bit of Aunt May, but besides some small pieces of story, there wasn't a whole lot of new stuff shown off.
Order in this city.
Whew. Anyone else need a breather?
We received a cinematic teaser for the upcoming Ghost of Tsushima, an open-world samurai game set in 13th century Japan. We don't know much about it besides the fact that it's currently in development by Sucker Punch, the studio behind the infamous and Sly Cooper series, and that it's set on Tsushima Island. Also, the bad guy is a Mongol invader. You'd think they knew better than to invade Japan, but historically they have been the exception to a lot of things.
I can see that. You trained your whole life for this.
A trailer that surprised me a little was for the mystery thriller Erica, which is currently in development for the PS4's PlayLink. Essentially, it's a new method for enjoying multiplayer games in which each player interacts with the game through their smartphone. If the graphics for Erica look particularly realistic to you, well, that's because they are real. These are live-action performances. Apparently, the FMV game isn't dead. The game's premise is that the titular protagonist, Erica, is dealing with a traumatic childhood experience when she's contacted by an old friend who believes that her memories are key to catching a killer, who at some point gets into contact with Erica, tearing open old emotional wounds and calling everything into question. It's up to players to decide who's telling the truth. This all sounds like an interesting hybrid of game and movie, and I'm curious as to how it'll pan out. Hopefully we hear more about Erica at the PlayStation Experience. The indie roguelite platformer Spelunky was a huge deal when it was originally released for free on PC. The HD version of Spelunky, which was released on PC and consoles later, was quite profitable. It's one of the best-loved platformers of recent years, and as revealed at the Paris Games Week, it's receiving a sequel that's coming to both the PS4 and PC. We don't know when Spelunky 2 is coming out, but it seems that it stars the child of the original game's protagonist, and it's definitely going to be one to watch in the coming months. The Paris Games Week wasn't the only big gaming event of the week, however, as BlizzCon 2017 kicked off on Friday. Some pretty big StarCraft 2 news was announced, specifically that the game is going free-to-play on November 14, 2017. This includes access to the Wings of Liberty campaign, that is, the single-player story modes starring the humans, along with access to ranked multiplayer, though that must be unlocked by proving yourself in the game's unranked mode, in order to keep out scrubs, presumably. If you already own Wings of Liberty, you'll be getting Heart of the Swarm for free. If you already own Heart of the Swarm, well, have fun with the new players. Blizzard's other massive franchise, Overwatch, got some big and exciting announcements. First off, the Blizzard World map is coming to Overwatch. This map features Blizzard's other franchises ranging from StarCraft to Warcraft to Lost Vikings. It's an interesting concept for a map, and it doesn't seem to be set in the world of Overwatch quite like the other maps, unless you mean to tell me that Blizzard games exist in that universe. Then again, we have seen Hearthstone in at least one Overwatch cinematic, so perhaps this is confirmation that the Blizzard games are fiction within the Overwatch universe? Perhaps. The most interesting bit of Overwatch news is of a new character named Mora, a mad scientist with abilities that allow her to drain enemy HP to give to her own teammates, teleportation, and her ultimate provides a blast of healing for her team, and it can bust through enemy shields in order to deal damage. It's nice to see another support character coming to Overwatch. Now, her story is pretty interesting. In the world of the game, her genetic experiments proved controversial, and she was an outcast among her peers. Her cinematic is gonna be awesome once it's finally released, I guarantee it. But wait! There's a brand new Overwatch animated short that perfectly describes what it's like being stuck with a bad Reinhardt.
I love the wind in my hair.
Get back and protect your team!
Ah, they're just slowing me down.
If Blizzard ever does an Overwatch movie, I'm gonna be the first in line for tickets. So, what do you think about this news from BlizzCon and the Paris Games Week? Any games that you're excited for? Or thoughts on the upcoming updates? Hit us up on Twitter at OneRuleBeCool and let us know. As somebody who does a fair amount of gaming on a smartphone, I've always been on the fence about mobile phones that are meant to double as gaming devices. Remember the Nokia N-Gage? Yeah, these things haven't usually turned out particularly well, or profitable. The thing is, most mobile games are built around existing mobile game hardware, and indeed, they're built around the way that we use our mobile devices. Quick experiences that you can pop into and out of that employ your touchscreen. So we don't see a whole lot of particularly deep or complex mobile games getting popular. While there are some mobile devices with physical controls, and also there exist quite a few Bluetooth-based devices that allow you to hook up a controller to your phone, most of the mobile games that people play just don't take advantage of these things. I'm bringing this up because earlier in the week, game hardware developer Razer took aim at the mobile gaming market with the announcement of the Razer Phone, an Android-based device with 8GB of RAM, 64GB of internal storage with microSD card support, and a 4000 mAh battery. Earlier in the year, Razer bought NextBit, an independent smartphone maker that released the Robin back in 2015, after kickstarting it. This new Razer phone could be thought of as the Robin 2, as it does bear some semblance to its predecessor, though it does seem to have some issues right out of the box. And none of the boxes have quite shipped yet. This Razer phone is a $700 device, and it doesn't have a headphone jack. Are smartphone manufacturers stuck on stupid in this ongoing power grab to shut the analog hole? Will you be getting one of these things? Personally, I love the idea of an overpowered smartphone. I liked the concept of the Motorola Atrix, and frankly, I'd like to see Android expand into a more general-purpose operating system. So even though this Razer phone lacks a headphone jack, it does have some appeal to me. That said, most games aren't going to be able to take advantage of all that RAM. From an economic standpoint, this doesn't strike me as a great investment. I'd much rather buy a cheap Xiaomi or Lenovo phone with good specs for $200 and spend the remaining $500 on 1,000 good games. Or maybe even 2,500 mediocre ones. So are you willing to part with your hard-earned cash for this Razer phone? Well, whatever you think about it, be sure to share your thoughts with us at OneRuleBeCool on Twitter. We'd be more than happy to share your thoughts on our next episode. This has been a rough couple of weeks for a couple big games. Last week, Gearbox's Battleborn received its final update, which added skins and some other cosmetic elements, rebalanced character abilities, and added some bug fixes. Gearbox has now shifted their focus to development on Borderlands 3. At least that's what everybody's assuming, though there hasn't been any announcement regarding it. The Borderlands series is pretty much Gearbox's flagship. To talk about Battleborn, however, it's a game that was launched at a somewhat awkward time, May 2016. It was up against Blizzard's Overwatch, which has since become a billion-dollar franchise for Activision Blizzard. While both games have some similarities on the surface, both being objective-oriented team-based first-person action games, Battleborn seems to have greater diversity in character abilities and gameplay, and it's more reminiscent of traditional MOBAs, whereas Overwatch leans more towards traditional FPS in its gameplay modes. This week, gigantic developer Motiga has been shut down by publisher Perfect World. In case you've not heard of Motiga, they released their MOBA, Gigantic, earlier in the year on the Xbox One and Windows. This game spent years in development and overcame so many hurdles to its release that it seems a shame that it's wound up where it is. See, Gigantic was announced in 2014 with a slick trailer in a market that was excited for it. You see, MOBAs were big business a few years ago. Back when Dota 2 and League of Legends hit it big, it seemed as though everybody suddenly had a MOBA in development. Everybody was vying to be the next big thing in the esports arena. Here's the thing about tossing your hat into a genre of multiplayer games with ever-changing metas. Most people only play one, maybe two if they're very different. For instance, I pretty much forgot about Dota 2 once I got into Overwatch, and while I took advantage of Battleborn going free in order to at least try it out, I didn't stick with the game because frankly, my multiplayer action game focus is still with Overwatch. While I will still occasionally pop in for a casual round of Awesomenauts, my attention is being held by a single game. So, guess what happens when the market is filled with a bunch of games with similar and engrossing mechanics that take a long time to learn? That's right, folks. Most of those games do not survive. Dawngate closed. Infinite Crisis suffered a crisis of incredibly finite profitability. Dead Island Epidemic dead in the water. Rise of Immortals Battle for Graxia certainly not living up to the first half of its name. Gigantic, at first, was a more traditional MOBA that was more about two teams making their way through a dungeon before fighting one another, as well as a massive boss creature. However, it turned out that the PvP element of the game was more engaging than just fighting the boss. Hence, the developers decided to make these bosses part of each team. To put this in some perspective, if you're a Dota 2 player, imagine if the goal was to get Roshan to leave his pit and join your team. That's what's going on in Gigantic. Now, the game's development was not without its challenges. Motiga ran out of cash early on in their development cycle, and they needed to forge a publishing deal with Microsoft in order to bring the game to Windows 10 and the Xbox One exclusively. In 2015, there were layoffs at the studio, and in February, Motiga was all out of money. Everybody was out of a job and laid off. And that was supposed to be the end. And yet, the next day, all the employees showed up, and development on Gigantic continued until the studio was bought up by Perfect World Entertainment, which allowed them to pay their employees and release the game. There's a fantastic article about the development of Gigantic over at PC Gamer which goes into depth on their struggles. We'll leave a link to it on our site for this episode of 1RBC Gaming Weekly if you'd like to read it. It seems that right now is not a great time for launching a multiplayer action game. Besides Battleborn and Gigantic, last week saw The Amazing Eternals fall victim to the axe. That game was being developed by Digital Extremes, the company behind Warframe. Now, The Amazing Eternals was still in closed beta when the announcement came of its shutdown. I hadn't even heard of the game before discovering that it was already dead. For some perspective, Digital Extremes' other game, Warframe, is the 4th most popular game on Steam. That they pulled this thing from the market before it could really go anywhere is telling of the nature of the market. Unfortunately for developer Motiga, it looks like nobody's going into work tomorrow. That said, since the game's in the hands of Perfect World, it will continue to run for the foreseeable future. Hopefully the developers over there don't wreck Gigantic's incredibly clever gameplay in order to turn it into some sort of pay-to-win cash cow. For the time being, it seems a little portentous that searching for Battleborn on Steam also brings up Gigantic. A sign of things to come? Perhaps. What do you think about Gigantic? Did you ever get to play it? And if so, what did you think? Hit us up on Twitter at OneRuleBeCool and share your thoughts. We'd be happy to share them on our next episode of 1RBC Gaming Weekly. This just in, Runic Games has shut down. The developer behind the Torchlight series as well as the recently released Hob. Personally, I'm sad about this one. Like, I feel sorry for all the teams and games that went down this week, but I was just playing Hob earlier in the week. I'm making my way through it for a review, and I've got to say that even though I'm still early on in the game, it's really cleverly put together. It's a 3D platformer in which you play as a little robot guy. You're making your way through a post-apocalyptic world full of life that's being threatened by some sort of spreading pollution. I just love how the world of the game is so quiet and yet so alive. If you're familiar with Hayao Miyazaki's Castle in the Sky, know that this game has a somewhat similar vibe. It's weird, really. After 9 years of triumphs and struggles, Runic is just gone. Their legacy will live on, however, as the Torchlight games were well loved, and Hob, while not that popular among players, earned a fantastic critical reception. The studio may be defunct, but the games are not forgotten. It is worth noting that publisher Perfect World Entertainment also owns Runic Games. Essentially, they'll be holding on to their IPs and most likely a few employees, but for the most part, the studio itself is dead. The Runic Games office in Seattle is dark tonight. Over on Twitter, Runic Games co-founder Travis Baldry dropped some interesting facts about the history of the studio. Apparently, they were almost owned by PopCap at some point, and interestingly enough, Torchlight 2 was originally going to be an MMO. Dropping some trivia is an interesting way to memorialize one's body of work. Are you a fan of Torchlight or Hob, and if so, what do you think about the shutdown of Runic Games? Hit us up on Twitter at OneRuleBeCool, and we'd be happy to share your thoughts on our next episode of 1RBC Gaming Weekly. In Nintendo news this week, Super Mario Odyssey has become the fastest-selling Super Mario game in history. Released last week for the Switch, Super Mario Odyssey has received overwhelmingly positive reception from both the players and the press. It's a Mario game that introduces some great new gameplay mechanics revolving around Mario's hat, Cappy. Cappy is now a character who, when tossed onto creatures in the game, can be used to control them. Thus far, this game's been getting nothing but praise for its fantastic design and innovative gameplay. It shakes up the Mario formula in all the right ways, and it sold over 1.1 million copies, and counting. In other Nintendo news, we'd like to remind you that Miiverse is shutting down on November 7th. Make your last posts right now. In case you didn't hear, Nintendo is killing the social network that linked together its Wii U games, thus destroying communities and killing discussion and fan art, with no plans to replace it or offer anything comparable on the Switch. We reported on the shutdown a while ago, and on YouTube our viewers have had a lot to say. We thank you all for your feedback, and we'd like to remind you that we're always listening. We don't mean that in a creepy way, by the way. In-game releases this week, Eponymous came to Mac, Windows, and Linux. Developed by Minor Key Games, which previously developed and published the roguelike Eldritch, Eponymous is a story-driven game that can be completed in about 10 minutes. The game's developer, J. Kyle Pittman, says that it's a Metroidvania walking simulator about unreliable structures and self-fulfilling prophecy. It's some pretty heady stuff. I've not tried it, but it does sound like an interesting premise. Eponymous is available on itch.io. If you're a fan of Sim Tower, you may want to check out SKYSCRAPER, which was released on Steam this week for Mac and Windows. The game's premise is that you've won a contract to start a city in the sky, but you have to try and strike a balance between profitability and sustainability. It seems that architecture and aesthetic also play quite a part in the game, and if you'd like to walk around and explore your tower, it's possible because SKYSCRAPER also boasts support for VR headsets. Now, I haven't heard a whole lot about SKYSCRAPER, but thus far it's gotten pretty good reception from the players, so it is worth checking out if you're into sim-type games. In crowdfunding news this week, the game Wolfgang went live on Kickstarter. Now, full disclosure before we proceed, I've spoken to the game's developer on Twitter. In fact, the developer has purchased a copy of my book, Playing the Press, which is a guide to reaching video game journalists, so I want to get any of my own potential bias out of the way. That said, I would not cover a game on this show if I didn't think it was worthy. And while the animation in the Kickstarter trailer for Wolfgang looks a little rough, the game's premise sounds solid. Wolfgang is a turn-based tactics game about wolves in sheep's clothing. After being ostracized by his fellow sheeple, Otis, a literal black sheep, decides to sell them out to the wolves. If you'd like to try the game, there's a demo available through the Kickstarter page, posted on itch and GameJolt. Wolfgang is set to be released February of 2019 for Mac and Windows. Over on Fig, the crowdfunding platform that actually allows you to be an investor, a campaign for a game called Obelisk went live, and it's looking pretty promising. According to the official description, it's a side-scroller in which you play as Dave, an interplanetary insurance salesman traveling and fighting aggressive fauna across the galaxy with no one but your trusty corporation-approved mech AI for company. I can't help but be reminded of the absolutely fantastic Risk of Rain, which has a somewhat similar premise, but doesn't really focus that heavily on the story except for a brief moment at the end. Now, Obelisk seems to be digging into some of the implications of flying into alien worlds and blowing up wildlife. According to the Fig page, it's about questioning the place of AI and big data in the world around us, and what implications it has for our species as we continue to evolve in an increasingly technologically driven world. It's a pretty big subject. Now, will the final game deliver on that premise? That remains to be seen. That said, the gameplay looks solid and the pixel art is absolutely beautiful. Check out Obelisk on Fig if you're looking for what may turn out to be a thought-provoking, action-packed platformer. If you're looking for a good deal on some great games, hot news. The humble Day of the Devs bundle is currently live. Day of the Devs, in case you haven't heard of it, is an indie game festival taking place on Saturday, November 11th at the Midway in San Francisco. This humble bundle, in the Pay What You Want tier, includes Tumbleseed, Grim Fandango, and Loot Rascals. Beat the average and you get Day of the Tentacle, Flintook, and Obzu. $9 or more will net you Full Throttle Remastered and everything. No, not literally everything, though I suppose that does include everything else in the bundle. Rather, the video game Everything, which is a rather bizarre adventure that involves the philosophy of Alan Watts and will enable you to become one with the universe, or at least make you wonder why real animals don't have such funky walk cycles. Grabbing this bundle for me was a no-brainer. I've wanted Tumbleseed for quite a while, and really, you just have to drop $1 if you want it. I got to try it out, and I have to say that it's really unique. You control a platform and roll around while climbing a mountain, all the while trying to avoid obstacles. You see, it's a little seed that you're rolling around, and you don't control the seed directly. Instead, you control the platform while trying not to fall into holes. In spite of its cute aesthetic, Tumbleseed is really challenging, and it's well worth picking up. The other games in the bundle are fantastic as well. Though I have yet to get around to it, I'm really excited to have Abzu in my library. Now, Abzu is an adventure game set underwater. It's serene, mysterious, soothing, and it got a fantastic critical response. Have you picked up this bundle? If so, what do you think about it? Hit us up on Twitter at OneRuleBeCool and be sure to share your thoughts. We'd be happy to share them on next week's episode. Finally, we leave you with a trailer for bullet hell game Text Wormhole, which was released on Steam this week and it looks aesthetically stunning. Enjoy. That's it for this week's game news. For all the greatest game news, interviews, and more, be sure to follow at OneRuleBeCool on Twitter and Instagram. Follow me at Jordan_Cameron for my own views.